Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive. This time, we're diving into this concept called Wu's cycle. Have you ever heard of this?
Yeah, Wu's cycle is fascinating. It's this idea that information technologies tend to follow this cyclical pattern of, going from openness to kind of like a closing and back and forth
And this is like throughout history, right?
throughout
Hey,
history.
we're
Right?
not just talking about the internet.
That's right. Yeah, we see it in the early days of the telephone. We see it with Hollywood in the 1930s, even with something like FM radio, all these different industries.
And it's all kind of predictable in a way.
It is.
Yeah.
And that's what makes it so powerful, right? Because
Yeah.
if we understand this pattern, we can maybe anticipate where things are headed.
So for our listeners today, we've actually got a bunch of research here on all these different examples. We've got stuff about the telephone. We've got the golden age of Hollywood. Like you said, we've got FM radio.
Yeah, and it's amazing how much these seemingly different industries, they all kind of went through the same kind of struggles. They all dealt with information in one way or another.
Right.
And when you look at them through the lens of Wu's cycle, it's like you see this underlying pattern.
Okay. So let's break it down. How does this cycle work? Like, what are the key stages that we see play out again and again?
Well, typically it starts with a burst of innovation, right? You've got all these independent inventors, small companies just kind of like popping up everywhere with all these new
Oh,
ideas.
so this is like the exciting part.
It is. It's chaotic, but it's also incredibly fertile ground for breakthroughs.
So it's kind of like the Wild West of invention.
Exactly. Yeah. But then as the technology matures, as it becomes more valuable, that's when the big players start to move in.
Okay, so then the big money comes in.
Right. And they see the
Right.
potential for profit and they try to consolidate power, maybe through mergers, acquisitions, sometimes even influencing regulations to kind of tilt the playing field in their favor.
And so the lone inventor gets pushed aside by the big corporation.
Yeah, it's a familiar story. And we have a perfect example of this, Theodore Vail and the Bell telephone system.
Oh, yeah, wasn't he like the ultimate control freak or something?
Well, he definitely believed that a single unified system was the best way to deliver telephone service. And to be fair to him, he wasn't entirely wrong.
I guess when you think about all those wires and everything, it does make sense.
And it's interesting because his vision didn't just stop at telephones. It actually influenced the development of radio, television, even the film industry.
Wait a minute, hold on. How could one guy focused on telephones have that much influence on these other industries?
It's a great question. And it wasn't just the technology itself, it was his ideology, his way of thinking about things. He believed that centralizing control, like having one entity in charge, was the most efficient way to manage any complex system.
Right.
And that idea, it resonated. It kind of spread like wildfire across different sectors.
It's almost like he created a blueprint for control, and other industries just copied it.
In a way, yeah. And it makes you wonder, right? Is this just human nature? Do we inevitably gravitate towards control and order, even if it means sacrificing some of that initial openness?
Well, I'm glad we're having this deep dive because I need to
Yeah.
know, I mean, are there any examples where this cycle was broken, like where things didn't go towards consolidation?
Oh, absolutely. And one of the most fascinating examples is the early days of Hollywood. It's like a classic David versus Goliath story.
I love those.
Back then, Thomas Edison and his company, they were like the gatekeepers of the film industry. They had patents on everything, the
Yeah.
cameras, the projectors, even the film stock itself. They basically had a stranglehold on the whole thing.
Well, so it was like a totally closed system, even back then.
Totally closed, yeah. But then along came these independent filmmakers, these rebels who were like, no way, we're not going to let Edison control everything.
Also, like the indie filmmakers of today, right?
Exactly. And some of the biggest names in Hollywood, like Carl Laemmle, who founded Universal Studios, and William Fox, who started Fox Film Corporation, they were among these rebels.
So they're the ones who kind of broke the mold, huh?
They did. And they face huge challenges, lawsuits, boycotts, even threats of violence.
Wow.
But they persevered.
What did they actually do to, like, escape Edison's control?
Well, they did something pretty drastic. They literally packed up and moved their operations across the country to California.
He just went west?
They went west, far from Edison's reach on the East Coast.
Wow.
Out there in California, they were free to make their own films, to experiment, to innovate without being held back by Edison's patents and restrictions. And that, my friend, is how Hollywood was born.
So Hollywood was like a rebellion against this control.
It was a victory for openness and decentralized filmmaking.
Okay, but I have a feeling the story doesn't end there, right?
Yeah.
Knowing Wu's cycle, this probably wasn't a happily ever after situation.
You're right. As inspiring as those early days were, Hollywood eventually succumbed to the same pattern we've been talking about.
They became the very thing they were fighting against.
Exactly. The studios, they grew in power and they started implementing these practices like block booking, where they forced theaters to buy bundles of their films, even the bad ones, if they wanted access to the big hits.
Oh, so they were like, you want to show Star Wars, you got to take this other clunker too.
Pretty much. It was all about control, about maximizing their profits, even at the expense of creativity and diversity.
Well, this is starting to feel a little depressing, isn't it? It's like
Yeah.
no matter how hard you try to break the cycle, it always comes back around.
I hear ya. But before we get too doom and gloom, let's talk about another example. And this one's a bit of a surprise. FM radio.
Oh, yeah. What's the story with FM radio? I mean, I always thought it was just like a natural evolution from AM radio.
The truth is, it wasn't that simple. The story of FM radio is actually a cautionary tale about how powerful interests can suppress a superior technology for decades, just to protect their own turf.
Okay, now I'm intrigued.
Back in the 1930s, you had FM radio, invented by this brilliant guy, Edwin Armstrong. And FM offered way better sound quality, less interference than the existing AM radio. It was objectively a better technology.
Okay, so why didn't it just take off? What happened?
Well, you had this major player in the AM radio industry, RCA, and they saw FM as a direct threat to their business model.
Makes sense.
They had invested millions in AM infrastructure and programming.
They had all their chips on AM.
Right, and they weren't about to just let it all become obsolete.
Oh, so it's kind of like those old taxi companies resisting ride-sharing apps.
Exactly, protecting their turf. And RCA, they teamed up with the FCC, and they used their influence to basically delay the adoption of FM radio for decades.
Wow, even though it was a better technology.
Even though it was objectively better. Think about that. How many other potentially game-changing innovations might have been suppressed throughout history just because of similar power dynamics? It's mind-boggling.
So Wu's cycle isn't just some abstract theory. It has real-world consequences. It affects what we get to see, what we get to hear, how we experience the world.
Exactly. And that brings us to the big question. The internet. Where does the internet fit into all of this? How does this cycle apply to the digital world we live in today?
Because I'm feeling a little nervous right now about the future of the internet.
I understand. And to really grapple with that question, we need to trace the internet's journey through Wu's cycle. We need to go back to its roots, to the very principles it was built on. The early internet, it was really all about decentralization and open protocols. It was designed to be this network of networks, a truly open space for information exchange. You know, the pioneers behind it, folks like Vint Cerf, they really believed in collaboration, in free access, in sharing information.
So it's the opposite of what that Vail guy was pushing for with the telephone system.
Yeah, it was almost like a deliberate rejection of that kind of centralized control. And in those early days, there was this incredible sense of optimism, this feeling that the internet could be this great equalizer, this force for good in the world.
It sounds like a digital utopia. Did that open spirit last?
Well, like all the other industries we've talked about, the internet, it went through its own cycles of openness and closing. Those early days, they were a bit like the Wild West, full of experimentation and excitement, but also a lot of chaos and uncertainty.
And then the big players came in,
Okay.
like those massive internet companies we see today.
Right, Google, Facebook, Amazon, the list goes on. And they brought a lot of innovation, a lot of convenience, but their size and their influence, it inevitably raises concerns about control and the potential for, well, a new closing phase.
Okay, yeah, let's talk about those concerns.
Yeah.
You mentioned closed platforms earlier. What exactly are they, and why should we be worried about them?
Imagine like a walled garden, right? It's controlled, it's predictable, but it also limits your choices. It limits innovation. That's what a closed platform is like. And companies like Apple, with their iPhones, iPads, and their tightly controlled app store, they represent a shift towards this kind of experience.
And it's kind of ironic, isn't it? Because Apple was once seen as this champion of openness back in the days of the Apple IIN.
It really goes to show how the pendulum can swing back and forth in Wu's cycle. But there's another historical parallel we need to consider here, and that's the rise of media conglomerates. They played a huge role in what you might call the second great closing of information industries in the late 20th century.
Can you remind me what a media conglomerate is again? And how do they relate to the internet?
Sure, so a media conglomerate, it's basically a giant corporation that controls both the content and the distribution channels for information. Think back to companies like AOL Time Warner. They owned movie studios, record labels, cable networks, even internet service providers. They had their fingers in every pie.
So they had control over every step of the process,
Yeah.
from creating the content to actually delivering it to people's homes.
Exactly. Their whole strategy was to control the entire pipeline. And it led to this massive concentration of power, fewer choices for consumers.
And what happened? Did it work?
Well, that's the interesting part. They ultimately failed to dominate the internet. In fact, the AOL Time Warner merger, it's considered one of the biggest corporate blunders in history.
Wow, really? But why didn't it work? It seemed like they had all the pieces in place.
They underestimated the internet's fundamental nature. The internet, it's inherently decentralized. It resists this kind of top-down control. It's like trying to tame a wild beast. You can try to put it in a cage, but it's always going to find a way to break free.
So you're saying the internet is inherently resistant to monopolies?
It's definitely more difficult to dominate than traditional media industries. The internet's open architecture, the sheer volume of information flowing through it, it makes control a real challenge.
That does offer a glimmer of hope. But you said earlier that we can't be complacent, right?
That's right. Because the forces of centralization, they're always at work. Take the debate over net neutrality, for example. That's a modern-day battle over control of the internet.
Yeah, we touched on that earlier. Can you explain exactly what net neutrality is and why it's so important?
Think of the internet as a highway system, right? Net neutrality means that all data travels at the same speed, regardless of its source or destination. It ensures a level playing field for everyone. Without it, internet service providers, they could favor certain types of traffic over others, creating like a two-tiered internet.
So my internet provider could slow down my Netflix stream while giving priority to a competing streaming service that they happen to own or have a deal with.
Exactly. That's one potential consequence. And it really highlights how control over the internet's infrastructure can be used to influence what we see, how we access information, and ultimately how we experience the world.
It's a little unsettling, to be honest. It feels like we're constantly walking this tightrope between openness and control, between innovation and consolidation. Are we just destined to repeat the mistakes of the past? Or is there a way to break free from this cycle?
That's the question we all need to be asking ourselves, and I don't think there's an easy answer. But awareness is the first step. Understanding these historical patterns, recognizing the forces at play, it can help us make more informed choices about the future.
So it's not a lost cause. There's still hope for an open internet.
There's always hope, but it requires vigilance, and it requires action. We can't take the openness of the internet for granted. It's something we need to actively fight for, to protect, to nurture.
Okay, I'm feeling a bit overwhelmed, but also a little bit motivated. Where do we go from here? What can we do as individuals to make a difference? It all feels so big and complicated.
You know, our individual choices, they matter more than you might think. We can support companies that embrace openness, we can advocate for policies that protect net neutrality, and we can educate ourselves about the issues, about the forces at play. Remember, knowledge is power.
Yeah, that's empowering. It makes me feel like the future of the internet is at least partially in our hands. We're not just powerless pawns in this game. It's amazing how Wu's cycle keeps popping up. We've seen it with telephones, Hollywood, even FM radio. It's like this pattern of openness and closure. It's just baked into how we handle information as humans.
Yeah, it makes you wonder, right? Every new communication technology goes through these growing pains, the struggle between democratization and the desire for control.
And now we're seeing it play out with the internet. We started with this vision of a decentralized network, this open space for exchange, and now we're seeing these challenges from big tech companies and closed platforms.
Yeah.
It feels like we're at this tipping point where the internet could go in either direction.
I think you're right. The internet's future, it's not some predetermined path. It really is a reflection of the choices we make.
So we actually have agency. We can shape the direction of the internet.
Absolutely. Our actions matter, even the small ones. Supporting companies that are open, advocating for policies like net neutrality, staying informed about the issues, all of that contributes to a more open and accessible internet for everyone.
It's like if we believe in a more open internet and we act on those beliefs, we can actually make it happen. But what about the people who benefit from a closed internet. Those who want to control information limit our choices. They're not just going to disappear, are they?
No, of course not. The
Eh?
forces of control are always going to be there pushing back. That's why vigilance is so important. We need to be aware of how our choices are being influenced, how information is being filtered and controlled.
So it's a constant battle then.
Yeah.
Openness versus control.
In a way, yeah. But it's not a hopeless battle. Think about those filmmakers who defied Edison and created Hollywood, or the people who fought for decades to make FM radio mainstream. Those are examples of overcoming obstacles with persistence and a belief in a better future.
That's encouraging. It reminds us that history is shaped by individuals who challenge the status quo. So, what's the takeaway for our listeners today? What should they remember as they navigate this digital world?
The key is that the internet's future is not set in stone. It's dynamic, always evolving, and our choices shape it. By understanding Wu's cycle, by seeing these patterns of openness and closure, we can make more informed decisions about the technology we use, the policies we support.
We can break the cycle?
Exactly. We can choose to create a future where information flows freely, where innovation thrives, and where everyone has the opportunity to connect and share without limits.
It's a future worth fighting for. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into Wu's cycle and the future of the internet.
And to our listeners, we encourage you to keep exploring these ideas. The future is in our hands. Until next time.